He opens by stating 4 times what his letter is not. It is not an accusation against individuals. It is not cynicism. It is not nostalgia. Only after those 4 denials does he actually begin. Not out of nostalgia for an idealized past, he writes, and adds that he does not even wish to risk a political battle inside the Church. I write these words not out of disrespect for the papal office, but out of love for that office itself. 4 denials, offered before he even reaches his actual point. Anyone who takes this many precautions clearly knows exactly what he is about to do. And what comes next confirms it. Today, almost no one in the Church signs criticism like this with their full name. The man who signed this one is named Rob Mozarts. He is auxiliary bishop of the Dutch Diocese of Den Bosch. He is not a cardinal. He does not run a diocese of his own. He holds no Roman dicastery. He is the number 2 official in a diocese located in a country where religious practice has collapsed more severely over the past half-century than in almost any other corner of Europe. But he is a name anyone who has followed Dutch and international Catholic commentary in recent years already recognizes well. His interventions have been covered repeatedly by the international Catholic press, and they never go unnoticed. Above all, he is one of the very few sitting bishops anywhere in the world who signs criticism of this kind personally, under his own full name, rather than leaving it to an anonymous senior prelate or an unnamed source to say it for him. A distinction this channel has already noted matters considerably in coverage of other recent controversies, from the anonymous letters circulating around the SPX decree to the unsigned reconstructions attributed to unnamed Vatican sources. On August 13th, he published, on his own blog, an open letter addressed to Pope Leo XIV, written in both English and Dutch simultaneously, apparently to ensure it could not be dismissed as a regional or provincial complaint confined to Dutch-language Catholic media. The following day, Rorete Cayley republished it in full, a decision that, as this channel has already documented in prior coverage of that specific outlet's role in this ongoing story, tends to guarantee rapid circulation across the wider traditionalist and conservative Catholic press internationally. This is not a simple statement or a passing remark offered in an interview. It is a lengthy and carefully argued text, structured deliberately into sections, that opens with an ancient and foundational principle of canon law: salus animarum suprema lex. The salvation of souls is the supreme law. Everything that follows in the letter begins there. And Mozarts is explicit that this specific principle functions as his interpretive lens for everything else he writes. "My question is simple and sincere," he writes. "Does the synodal process actually help bring souls closer to Christ and to eternal salvation?" He immediately makes clear that, for him, this is the essential and governing question, the one against which every other consideration must be measured. "Good intentions deserve recognition," he writes, careful to acknowledge the sincerity of those who designed and have carried out the synodal process. But the next sentence closes off any escape route from his actual argument. "Good intentions do not exempt us from the duty to examine the fruits. By their fruits you shall know them." This is the criterion Christ himself gave, drawn directly from the Gospel of Matthew, and it is the criterion Mozarts explicitly and deliberately builds the entire remainder of his argument upon, rather than relying on his own personal judgment or preference. Those who judge the Synod on synodality purely by its own internally stated objectives, he writes, can easily write a positive account of it. There was listening, there was dialogue, thousands of people across the world were consulted. Then he takes a turn few expected from a letter framed this cautiously at its outset. It is not about how many meetings were organized, he writes, nor how many reports were drafted, nor how many people attended. Has faith been strengthened? Has Christ been proclaimed more clearly? Have more people converted? Does more people attend Sunday Mass? Are there more priestly vocations? When one actually asks these specific questions, he writes, it is impossible to consider the Synod a success. That specific sentence circulated around the world within 24 hours of the letter's publication, becoming the single most quoted line from the entire text across both traditionalist and mainstream Catholic outlets covering the story. The synodal work itself, he notes, is far from finished. The implementation phase continues through diocesan, national, and continental meetings and is scheduled to culminate in a further assembly in Rome in October 2028. This past May, the Vatican published a new roadmap governing that continued implementation. What began, he observes, as a synod convened for the specific and bounded period of 2021 to 2024 risks becoming, in his own words, a permanent form of governance, moving from being an instrument the Church uses toward becoming a system the Church is governed by. The first thing that stands out is already contained in the name itself, Mozart's notes with evident deliberateness. A synod on synodality. Traditionally, he explains, a synod was convened because the Church needed to debate something specific and concrete, a particular doctrinal question, a particular pastoral crisis, a particular disciplinary matter requiring the bishop's collective judgment. Here, by contrast, the actual object under discussion is the process itself, synodality as a method examining and legitimizing its own continued use. It could be compared, he writes, to a meeting called endlessly to discuss how future meetings should be held, an image that recurs repeatedly throughout the letter and that has become, in the days since its publication, something of a shorthand critique repeated across commentary on the story. The classical synod, in his framing, was always a means towards some further and specific end. In contemporary synodal discourse, he argues, synodality risks becoming an end entirely unto itself, and it is precisely there, he writes, that the underlying problem actually begins. The Church is not a conversation, he writes, in what is perhaps the single most theologically pointed sentence in the entire letter. It is a received reality. Because the Church does not begin with our dialogue, it begins with Christ. Christ did not create a discussion group, he continues. He called apostles, gave them authority, and sent them out specifically to proclaim, to baptize, and to teach, not merely to listen and to consult indefinitely. Truth, in Mozart's framing, is not produced by consensus, however broad or however carefully facilitated that consensus-building process might be. He then offers a theological example designed to leave no room whatsoever for ambiguity about what he actually means. If tomorrow 90% of Catholics stopped believing in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, he writes, Christ would still be truly present on the altar. The number of believers, however large or however small, does not change the underlying sacramental fact. What happens then when the desires of modern man collide directly with the gospel as the Church has always received and taught it? His answer is unambiguous. It is not the gospel that must change to accommodate modern man, but man himself who must change to conform to the gospel, and that in the Christian tradition, this specific process has always had a name: conversion. A word, he notes pointedly, that is heard remarkably rarely in contemporary ecclesial debates and synodal documents, especially by comparison with words like accompaniment, dialogue, and discernment that have come to dominate that same vocabulary. Less evangelization, he writes, more committees on evangelization. Fewer vocations, more documents about vocations. And he closes this particular section of his argument with a line that has been quoted almost as widely as his central sentence about the Synod's success. Fewer people in church, longer meetings about how to become church. A house on fire, he writes, has priorities other than housekeeping. He then lists, with the specificity of a man who has clearly been watching this unfold in his own country and diocese, rather than theorizing from a distance, what is actually happening on the ground across Western Europe. Churches emptying. Parishes merging into ever larger administrative units in an effort to conserve dwindling numbers of active priests. Monasteries disappearing. A phenomenon this channel has already documented in detail through the French monastery closure data covered in a previous episode. The confessional nearly vanished from ordinary parish life. A patient rarely improves, he writes, by taking the medicine of the patient in the next bed, who is even worse off than he is. This is the specific line the Dutch newspaper that broke the story chose to use in its own headline. Mozart speaks openly and without euphemism of what he calls the Protestantization of the Catholic concept of church, and the reference here is specifically to the mainline Protestant churches of Western Europe, institutions widely understood across ecumenical and sociological literature alike to have experienced institutional and numerical decline even more severe and more rapid than the Catholic Church's own difficulties in the same countries and over the same decades. The great Catholic reforms throughout history, he writes, almost never began with structures, committees, or synodal working groups. They began with saints, individual men and women whose personal holiness reshaped the church around them organically, rather than through administrative redesign imposed from above. His list of examples runs from Saint Benedict through Saint Teresa of Avila to Saint John Paul II, each representing, in his reading, a different century's answer to institutional crisis, rooted not in restructuring, but in sanctity. A parish with a holy pastor, he writes, has a better future than a diocese with 20 synodal working groups and well-paid diocesan directors overseeing them. Their program, he writes of the saints he names, was simple. Become saints. Nothing more elaborate than that. The quiet Catholic who goes to Mass every single morning, who prays the Rosary faithfully, and who teaches catechism to his own grandchildren, does not typically write a formal report for the Synod's consultation process, he observes. Neither does a contemplative nun living a hidden life of prayer, nor a mother of 6 children managing a demanding household. The world is not waiting, in his assessment, for one more organization to listen attentively to it. There are already, in his own words, more than enough organizations doing exactly that. The world, he writes in the letter's closing movement, is waiting instead for someone to tell it plainly what it was actually created for. When the world speaks with uncertainty, he writes, let Peter speak with clarity. This is the specific request he makes just before bringing his letter to a close, and beneath it appears not a pseudonym, not an anonymous attribution to an unnamed senior prelate, but his own full and complete signature. Rob Mozart's auxiliary bishop of the Diocese of Den Bosch. The response arrived the following day, and it did not come from Rome. It came from Mozart's own bishop, Gerard de Korte, in the pages of a Dutch newspaper. According to de Korte, no one had been consulted before the letter went public. A personal letter to the Pope, he said, would have been the correct approach, if Mozart genuinely does not want to sow division, as he himself claims in the text. In any case, de Korte added, a bishop or auxiliary bishop has his own proper channels for communicating with the Bishop of Rome. Notice what the objection actually targets, not the content of the letter, the channel Mozart chose to deliver it through. And then came the announcement attached to that same response. At the request of Pope Francis and Pope Leo XIV, the Dutch bishops will continue building a synodal church, with a national day scheduled for October 16th in Den Bosch, the same city where Mozart himself serves as auxiliary bishop. The newspaper that broke the story framed the letter differently than Mozart himself had. Its headline read that the auxiliary bishop had warned the Pope against Protestantization, and it summarized the letter as a request for less attention to be paid to ordinary believers. At this point, though, the letter itself says something different. It does not ask for the faithful to be listened to less. It argues, specifically, that it is always the same people who make themselves heard in these synodal processes, and that Catholic silence, within a synodal framework built around who chooses to speak up, never actually gets registered as a voice at all. One detail remains unresolved, and it is the detail that puts the entire episode into proper perspective. By 2020, Mozart had already resigned from nearly all of his administrative responsibilities within the diocese, according to reporting from Gloria TV. The reason was specifically disagreements with Bishop de Court, the very same man who, 6 years later, explained to the press the correct way for Mozart to write to the Pope. That detail matters for understanding this story honestly, rather than as a simple morality play with a clear hero and a clear obstructor. This is not the first time these two men have clashed, and it is worth being direct about what that history does and does not tell us. It does not, on its own, settle who is right about the substance of Mozart's argument regarding the fruits of the synodal process. A prior disagreement between a bishop and his auxiliary does not by itself invalidate either man's current position, and treating it as though it does would be its own kind of dishonest shortcut. What it does tell us is that this specific public letter did not emerge from a relationship of neutral or first-time tension. It emerged from an already strained working relationship between two churchmen who have disagreed before, which is worth knowing as context, even if it does not resolve the actual theological and pastoral questions the letter raises. Those questions deserve to be examined on their own merits, separate from the personal history between Mozart and his bishop. His central methodological claim that intentions and process metrics, meetings held, reports filed, participants consulted, cannot substitute for the actual criterion Christ gave for judging a spiritual undertaking, is not itself a controversial or fringe position within Catholic tradition. By their fruits you shall know them is Christ's own stated standard from the Gospel of Matthew, and applying it to an institutional process is a legitimate and traditional form of pastoral discernment, not an innovation Mozart invented for the occasion. What is more genuinely contestable and worth naming honestly is whether the specific fruits he cites, mass attendance, vocation numbers, conversion rates, are the right or only metrics by which to judge a multi-year global consultative process whose stated goals were never primarily about immediate numerical growth, but about listening, communal discernment, and strengthening bonds within a global church operating across radically different cultural and pastoral contexts. Defenders of the synodal process, a position this channel has represented fairly in prior coverage of Cardinal Grech and others involved in shepherding it, would argue that judging a process explicitly designed around listening and ecclesial communion by the same metrics one might apply to an evangelization campaign is something of a category error, measuring one kind of undertaking by a yardstick built for a different one entirely. That is a serious counter-argument, and it deserves to be represented here rather than left out simply because Mozart's letter has generated more attention. At the same time, Mozart's underlying point that a process consuming this much institutional time, energy and resources across multiple years and multiple assemblies, and now apparently extending toward becoming a permanent structural feature of church governance rather than a time-limited consultative exercise, ought eventually to be measured against some observable outcome beyond its own internal procedural completion, is not an unreasonable standard to raise. His image of a meeting convened endlessly to discuss how future meetings should be held captures a genuine and recognizable institutional risk that exists in any large organization, secular or religious, when process itself gradually becomes insulated from outcome. Whether the Synod on Synodality has actually fallen into that specific trap is a judgment call reasonable people can disagree on, but the general risk he names is a real one, documented across the history of large bureaucratic institutions generally, not something unique to this specific synod or invented for polemical effect. His theological point about the Eucharist, that the real presence of Christ would remain true even if 90% of Catholics stopped believing it, deserves to be recognized for what it actually is. A restatement of a completely uncontested and foundational Catholic teaching regarding the objective nature of sacramental reality as distinct from subjective belief or consensus. This is not a controversial claim within Catholic theology, on any side of the current internal debates this channel has covered. Its inclusion in the letter functions as a broader illustration of his larger argument that truth in the Catholic understanding is received and objective rather than produced through consensus or dialogue, a principle that itself sits at the heart of long-standing and legitimate theological debate about how synodality, properly understood, should relate to the Church's teaching authority rather than substitute for it. His historical claim about reform movements beginning with saints rather than structures, tracing a line from Benedict through Teresa of Avila to John Paul II, is a genuinely defensible reading of church history, though it is worth noting, in fairness, that many of those same reform movements also eventually required structural and institutional support to sustain and spread the renewal individual saints initiated. The Benedictine reform needed the structure of monastic rule and the network of monasteries themselves to become the civilizational force it became. Teresa of Avila's reform of Carmel required the institutional structure of the Discalced Carmelite order to survive and spread beyond her own lifetime. Sanctity and structure are not, in Catholic history, actually opposed to one another in the clean way Mozart's rhetorical framing might suggest, even though his underlying point that structure without genuine holiness produces little lasting fruit remains a fair and important one worth taking seriously on its own terms. What makes this specific letter significant, beyond the substance of its individual arguments, is precisely what this video's opening noted. The rarity of a sitting bishop, even an auxiliary bishop without independent diocesan authority, putting this kind of critique in writing under his own full name rather than through the anonymous or pseudonymous channels that have become the more common vehicle for this kind of institutional criticism in recent years, a pattern this channel has already documented in prior coverage of Cardinal Fernandez's own record and the broader climate surrounding the SPX excommunication decree. Mozart's decision to sign his own name, 4 careful denials notwithstanding, is itself a form of institutional risk-taking that deserves to be weighed alongside the substance of what he actually wrote, precisely because so few of his fellow bishops appear willing to take that same risk publicly, whatever private agreement they may or may not share with his specific conclusions. The response from his own diocese focused entirely on the channel he used rather than engaging any of his substantive arguments about synodal fruits, follows a pattern this channel has now documented repeatedly across multiple stories. Institutional responses to traditionalist or conservative criticism that address procedure, tone, or appropriate channels of communication, rather than directly engaging the underlying theological or pastoral substance being raised. Whether that pattern reflects a genuine and considered judgment that the substance does not merit direct engagement, or reflects an institutional preference for managing dissent through procedural correction rather than substantive theological debate, is a fair question this specific episode leaves entirely open, and one worth continuing to track as this story, and the broader synodal process itself, continues developing toward its scheduled 2028 conclusion in Rome. What do you think? Leave a comment below. Amen. God bless you.